I am Hannah Reed, and I am 27 years old, now old enough to understand language that once confused me, old enough to recognize the moment my childhood ended. Not with a scream or a slap, but with a smile, a suitcase and a door closing behind my mother. I was 11 the summer my mother, Margaret Reed, decided she needed a break from responsibility and chose Europe as the place where she would finally breathe again, and I remember standing in our narrow hallway watching her adjust the strap of her purse like she was heading to the grocery store instead of leaving her only child alone for a month. She pressed a single $20 bill into my hand, the paper already soft and creased, as if it had been passed through too many careless fingers before it reached mine, and she said it lightly, almost proudly. "Hannah, you are independent. Now you are not a baby anymore. Just order food if you need to." And then she smiled, the kind of smile adults use when they want to believe their own words more than the truth in front of them. I remember the sound of the suitcase wheels as she pulled it toward the door, the scrape of plastic against concrete echoing through the house. And I remember how I nodded because nodding was what I had learned to do when adults spoke, as if decisions had already been made. My father, David Reed, stood near the kitchen doorway, pretending to look for his keys, silent in the way he always was when my mother took control, and he did not meet my eyes when she bent down to give me a quick kiss on the forehead that smelled faintly of perfume and airport coffee. She did not ask if I was scared. She did not ask if I understood. She did not ask if anyone would be checking on me, and I did not ask either, because in our house, questions were treated like inconveniences. When the door closed behind her, the sound was sharp and final, a clean click of the lock that seemed too loud for such a small moment. And suddenly, the house felt larger than it ever had before. I stood there holding that $20 bill, my palm damp, my fingers shaking slightly, and I told myself out loud that I would be fine because the silence was already pressing in, and I needed something to push back against it. At 27, I can name what that moment was, but at 11, I only felt a strange mix of pride and fear. Pride because my mother had called me independent, fear because independence felt a lot like being dropped into deep water without being taught how to swim. My mother liked to talk about independence as if it were a badge of honor. She had given me something that proved she was raising me right, and she used that word often when it suited her, especially when it allowed her to step away. Independence meant I did not complain when she worked late. Independence meant I did not ask for help with homework. Independence meant I did not need comfort when she was tired, and that day, independence meant she could leave the country and trust that the house would not burn down in her absence. She never said the word alone, but that was what independence translated to in my body as I walked through the living room after she left. Noticing the way the air seemed to settle without her voice filling it, I wandered into the kitchen and looked at the counter where she had tossed a shiny emergency credit card like it was a solution instead of a symbol, and I remember picking it up and turning it over in my hands, noticing that it felt heavier than the $20 and yet somehow less useful because I did not know how it worked. The refrigerator hummed softly behind me, the same sound it had always made, and I opened it out of habit, scanning the shelves the way I did when I was bored. Only this time my eyes lingered longer on what was not there. A half-empty carton of milk, a few condiments leftovers wrapped in foil that looked tired and old, nothing that resembled a plan. At 11, I did not have the words to call it negligence, but my body reacted anyway, a tightening in my chest, a small knot forming in my stomach that had nothing to do with hunger yet. I went back to the hallway and sat on the bottom step of the stairs, the $20 bill still clenched in my hand, and I remember thinking that I should put it somewhere safe because it suddenly felt like the most important thing in the house. That piece of paper was not just money. It was time. It was food. It was my mother saying without saying it that I was on my own now. As I sat there, I could hear my parents' car start in the driveway, the engine turning over, the sound of tires on gravel, and then nothing. No wave from the window, no last check to see if I was watching, just the absence where they had been. I did not cry then, not because I was strong, but because crying would have meant admitting something was wrong, and in my family wrong. Things were smoothed over, reframed, turned into lessons about resilience. Instead, I stood up and walked through the house as if I were inspecting it for the first time, touching the back of the couch, the edge of the dining table, the doorframe to my parents' bedroom. all the things that made it feel like a place where adults lived and made decisions. I told myself I would treat this like a challenge, something I could win, and that thought gave me a strange sense of control that did not last long but mattered in that moment. Looking back now, I can see the irony of it in 11-year-old deciding to win abandonment by complying with it. I can see how neatly my mother had wrapped her choice in language that made it sound reasonable, even admirable, how she had turned my need into a flaw she believed she had already fixed. When I tell people now that my mother took a month off in Europe and left me alone at 11, they often react with shock, but the shock is not what stays with me. What stays with me is that smile, the way she said independent, as if it were a gift, and the way I believed her because believing her was easier than naming the fear that settled into the house after she left. That day did not feel like the beginning of something dramatic. There was no music swelling, no immediate disaster. Just an ordinary afternoon stretched too thin by responsibility that did not belong to me. But that was the moment everything shifted, the moment I learned that adults could choose themselves over their children and call it growth, and that a child could be left holding a $20 bill and a story that would take years to tell. I did not know then that what followed would force me to become something my mother never expected. Not just independent, but observant. Not just resilient, but precise. Not just quiet, but capable of turning memory into record. All I knew as I stood in that hallway was that the house was too quiet, the door was locked, and I was alone in a way that felt different from being home by myself before. At 27, I can say this clearly, that was not independence, it was abandonment, dressed up as trust, and it was the first lie that set everything else in motion. I did not understand that my family was toxic when I was 11 because toxicity does not announce itself with raised voices or broken plates. It seeps in quietly through expectations, through praise, that comes with conditions through the steady message that love is earned by being easy to live with. And in the Reed household, I learned very early that being easy mattered more than being safe. My mother, Margaret Reed, was 49 that summer, young enough to believe her life was still unfolding somewhere else, and old enough to resent anything that slowed her down, including motherhood, though she would never have admitted that out loud. She presented herself to the world as a devoted parent, the kind who posted smiling photos and talked about sacrifice in abstract terms. But inside our house, sacrifice always seemed to be something she expected from other people. She believed deeply in appearances in the story she could tell about herself at work, to friends, to strangers, and I learned that my role was to support that story by not contradicting it. If she said she was exhausted, I was supposed to nod. If she said she needed space, I was supposed to shrink. If she said I was mature for my age, I was supposed to feel grateful instead of wondering why maturity felt like loneliness. My father, David Reed, was 52 and spent most of his time trying to keep the peace by staying out of the way, which meant that when my mother made decisions, he followed them with a silence that felt heavier than shouting ever could. He liked to describe himself as easygoing, but what that really meant was that he avoided discomfort even when avoidance came at my expense. When I tried to talk to him privately about feeling left out or confused, he would sigh softly and tell me that my mother worked very hard and that I should not make things harder for her, a sentence that trained me to see my needs as burdens long before I had the language to question it. In our family, conflict was treated as a failure of character rather than a natural part of relationships, and so everything unpleasant was smoothed over with jokes, with compliments that felt slightly sharp, with reminders of how lucky I was compared to other kids. Margaret loved to tell people that I was independent, that I never caused trouble, that I did not cling or cry. And every time she said it, I felt a small tightening in my chest because I knew what she really meant was that I did not demand anything from her. Independence became the currency of approval in our house, and I learned to spend it carefully. When I came home from school with a bad day, I would swallow it because sharing would mean asking for emotional energy my mother did not want to give. When I needed help with homework, I waited until she was in a good mood because catching her at the wrong time meant a lecture about how she did not have time to do everything for me. Even comfort had a schedule, and I learned to read it the way other children learned to read clocks. There was no single moment I could point to and say, this is when things became wrong because wrongness was normalized through repetition. Margaret did not hit me, she did not scream, she did not forget my birthday, and those facts were often used as proof that I was fine, that our family was fine, but neglect does not always wear obvious clothes. Sometimes it looks like a child who learns not to ask a child who measures her worth by how little she needs a child who internalizes the idea that love is conditional on convenience. I remember overhearing my mother on the phone once telling a friend that I was such a relief compared to other kids, that I was self-sufficient, that she did not have to worry about me. And at the time, I felt proud, but pride mixed with fear because I understood on some level that being a relief meant being replaceable. My father would smile and nod along, adding that I was wise beyond my years, and neither of them noticed how those words landed, how they built a cage out of compliments. By the time I was 11, I had already learned that being seen as strong meant I would be left alone more often, and being seen as needy meant I would be subtly punished with distance. That is the kind of lesson that settles into a child quietly and stays for decades. When my mother decided to go to Europe, she framed it as something she deserved a reward for years of hard work, and my father backed her up by talking about how good it would be for her mental health. No one framed it as a risk or a question or a decision that involved me. It was presented as a done deal that I was expected to adapt to. I remember my mother explaining it to me like a teacher explaining a project, outlining her itinerary, showing me pictures of places she would visit, and each detail seemed designed to reassure herself rather than me. She spoke quickly, confidently, and she never paused long enough for me to interrupt with doubts. When she said I would be fine, it was not a prediction, it was an instruction. My father chimed in with practicalities, reminding me where things were in the house, telling me not to worry, reinforcing the idea that worry itself would be a kind of failure on my part. There was an unspoken agreement between them that I would absorb whatever discomfort their choice created, and that agreement was built on years of conditioning. Looking back, I can see how carefully my mother had cultivated an environment where her needs came first without her ever having to say so directly. She talked often about stress, about being overwhelmed, about how much she did for everyone, and those narratives left little room for my own feelings to exist without guilt. If I ever expressed sadness or fear, it was quickly reframed as me being dramatic or ungrateful, and so I learned to present a calmer version of myself, one that would not disrupt the story she told about our family. Toxic families often operate on unspoken rules, and ours were clear even if no one ever listed them. Do not challenge the parent. Do not expose the family to outside scrutiny. Do not admit vulnerability. Do not need more than is offered. These rules kept the surface smooth while the foundation cracked, and by the time my mother left me alone with $20 and a promise that I could order food, those rules were so deeply ingrained that I did not question the arrangement out loud. I questioned it in my body instead, through the anxiety that kept me awake that first night, through the careful way I moved through the house as if I might break something just by existing too loudly. At 27, I can see how my father's silence played a crucial role in this dynamic, how his refusal to intervene validated my mother's choices and left me without an ally inside my own home. He was not cruel, but he was complicit, and complicity is often easier to live with than accountability, especially for adults who benefit from the status quo. When people ask me now why I did not call someone sooner, why I did not ask for help immediately, I think about this conditioning and how effective it was. I had been taught that asking would make things worse, that speaking up would create trouble, that my role was to cope quietly. Toxic families do not need locks on doors to keep children silent. They build the locks inside them. That summer, before hunger ever set in, before fear became sharp enough to name, I was already carrying the weight of expectations that did not belong to me. I was 11 years old, standing in a house that felt too big and too quiet, trying to live up to an image my mother had created, because failing that image felt more dangerous than being alone. It is important to understand this context because what came next did not happen in a vacuum. The month my mother left me was not an isolated mistake. It was the logical outcome of a family system that prioritized adult comfort over child safety and called it independence. By the time the door closed behind her, the damage was already in motion, not because she left, but because she believed leaving was acceptable, and because my father allowed that belief to stand unchallenged. That belief shaped my choices in the days that followed, It delayed my instinct to seek help. It turned survival into a private test of worth, and it set the stage for a confrontation that would force every unspoken rule into the open. The first 2 days after my mother left did not feel like an emergency, and that is what made them dangerous because I was still operating on the belief that if nothing dramatic happened right away, then the situation must be manageable. And at 11 years old, I was very good at mistaking quiet for safety. I remember waking up the morning after they left with a strange sense of purpose, the kind you get before a school project or a test, as if this were something I could organize my way through, and I told myself that if I treated the month like a challenge instead of a problem, I would come out on the other side with proof that my mother was right about me. I went into the kitchen and opened the cabinet, slowly taking inventory the way I had seen adults do when they cooked, counting cans, boxes, bags, trying to translate what I saw into time, though I had no real concept of how long food was supposed to last. There were a few cans of soup I did not know how to open safely, a box of pasta with no sauce to go with it, a jar of peanut butter that was already half gone, and a box of cereal that felt lighter than it should have when I lifted it. I lined things up on the counter, grouping them by what I thought made sense, and for a moment the act itself made me feel calmer, as if order could substitute for experience. I decided I would ration carefully, stretching what we had the way people did in movies about survival. And that thought gave me a small spark of pride because it sounded grown up and capable. I ate a bowl of cereal dry because the milk smelled slightly off, telling myself it was fine that people ate cereal without milk all the time, and I chewed slowly to make it last longer, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator as if it were keeping me company. That first day, I barely touched the $20, folding it carefully and tucking it into the pocket of my backpack like it was something precious. Something that could disappear if I was careless. I spent the afternoon watching television with the volume turned a little higher than usual, not because I was bored, but because silence had started to feel too loud, and I let shows play one after another without really paying attention, just grateful for the noise. Every so often I glanced at my phone, half expecting a message from my mother asking how I was doing, but the screen stayed dark, and each time I noticed it, I felt a small flicker of disappointment that I quickly pushed away. Disappointment felt like disloyalty. That night I went to bed early, telling myself that sleeping would make the time pass faster, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle, every creak sounding amplified in the dark. I hugged my pillow tightly, not because I was scared exactly, but because something in my body needed pressure, needed reassurance that there was still a boundary between me and the emptiness of the rooms beyond my door. The second day began much the same way, with me waking up determined to do better, to be more efficient, more careful, as if improvement were the key to making the situation work. I tried to make toast for breakfast and burned it slightly, scraping the blackened edges off with a knife, and eating what remained, telling myself that wasting food was worse than eating something that did not taste good. Afterward, I decided it was time to use the emergency credit card, partly because the idea of ordering real food felt comforting, and partly because I wanted to prove to myself that I could handle it. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone, scrolling through a delivery app, the way I had seen my parents do, choosing something simple and inexpensive, making sure not to spend too much because I had no idea how long the card was supposed to last. When I entered the card information and hit order, my heart beat a little faster, and for a brief moment I felt relief, imagining a knock at the door, a bag of food, something warm and normal entering the house. Then the screen refreshed and an error message popped up, telling me the payment could not be processed. I stared at it, convinced I had made a mistake, and tried again, double-checking the numbers, my fingers clumsy with nerves. The same message appeared. I tried a different app, then another each time, hoping the result would change, and each time feeling a little more exposed when it did not. I remember my throat tightening as the reality began to sink in that the card was not working, that the solution my mother had tossed onto the counter was not actually a solution at all. I stood up abruptly and walked around the kitchen, my movements quick and restless, as if motion itself could fix the problem. I picked up the card and turned it over in my hands, looking for instructions, a phone number, anything that would tell me what to do next, but there was nothing I could understand. Nothing designed for an 11-year-old to navigate alone. Panic flickered at the edges of my thoughts, but I pushed it down, telling myself there had to be another explanation, that maybe the app was down, that maybe I was just doing it wrong. Admitting that the card was useless would have meant admitting that my mother had left me without a real plan, and that thought felt too big to hold. Instead, I went back to the cabinets and opened them again this time with a different eye. Not organizing, but calculating, mentally assigning meals to days, trying to stretch the math in my favor. I ate another small bowl of cereal and drank water to fill the space it left behind, convincing myself that hunger was just my body adjusting, that it would settle if I ignored it. Throughout the day, I found myself narrating my actions in my head the way adults did, telling myself that this was what independence looked like, making decisions, adapting, not making a fuss. Each small success, like finding something edible or distracting myself long enough to forget the card, reinforced the illusion that I was in control. I did not call my parents not because I did not want to talk to them, but because I did not want to be the reason my mother felt guilty or interrupted, and that priority had already been established long before she left. By the end of the second day, I was tired in a way that felt deeper than usual. Not physically exhausted, but mentally worn down from constant vigilance, from thinking ahead, from monitoring myself so carefully. As I lay in bed that night listening again to the house breathe around me, I told myself that if I could get through the first few days, the rest would be easier, that I just needed to find my rhythm. What I did not realize then was that this sense of control was fragile, built on denial and hope, rather than resources, and that it would not survive contact with reality for much longer. At 11, I believed that effort could compensate for absence, that planning could replace care, and that being calm was the same as being safe. Those first 2 days were the calm before hunger sharpened into something I could not ignore, before silence turned into evidence, and before the quiet challenge I thought I was winning began to reveal its true cost. The moment I realized something was truly wrong did not arrive with panic or tears, but with a dull, sinking awareness that spread slowly through my chest, because by the third morning, the systems I had convinced myself would hold were already breaking down. I woke up hungry in a way that felt sharper than before, my stomach tight and hollow, and for the first time I noticed how quiet the house was without the television on, how even the refrigerator seemed to hum more weakly than usual, as if it too were conserving energy. I went straight to the kitchen and opened the pantry, staring at the shelves longer than I had the day before, trying to see possibility where there was very little left. The cereal box was nearly empty now. The peanut butter jar scraped thin along the sides, and the cans of soup I had avoided were still there untouched because the can opener hurt my hand the last time I tried to use it. I stood there longer than necessary, not moving, because movement would have meant deciding what to do next, and I was beginning to understand that my options were narrowing. I told myself that today I would make the credit card work, that the failures before had been my fault, that adults did not leave children with tools that did nothing, and clinging to that belief felt safer than questioning my mother's judgment. I set the card on the table, smoothed it flat with my palm, and picked up my phone again, determined to do it right this time. I chose the cheapest option I could find, something warm and filling, and when I entered the card information, my fingers moved slowly, carefully, as if precision alone could change the outcome. When the error message appeared again, identical to the ones before, something inside me went cold. I tried not to react, tried to breathe normally, but my heart began to beat faster, louder in my ears, and I felt a heat rise behind my eyes that I fought to keep back. I refreshed the screen, restarted the app, even turned my phone off and on again the way my father did when technology misbehaved, but nothing changed. Each rejection felt more personal than the last, not because the machine knew who I was, but because it confirmed a truth I had been avoiding, that the emergency card was not activated, that there was no hidden safety net waiting for me if things went wrong. I flipped the card over and over, looking for instructions for a phone number I could call, but even if I had found one, I realized with a sudden clarity that I would not know what to say, that the system assumed an adult on the other end of the line. The realization that the tools left for me were designed for someone else made my throat tighten, because it meant my presence in this situation had not been considered at all. I sat back in my chair and stared at the $20 bill still folded in my backpack, suddenly aware of how small that amount was when measured against time instead of snacks. I pulled it out and flattened it on the table, smoothing the creases the way my mother had smoothed her skirt before leaving, and for the first time, I tried to calculate how many days it might last if I was careful, how much each meal would cost, how quickly it would disappear. The math did not work, no matter how many times I ran it. And that was when the illusion I had been maintaining finally cracked. Hunger had been uncomfortable before, but now it felt strategic, something I had to plan around, and that shift changed the way my body reacted. My hands began to shake slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the effort of staying calm, and I noticed that when I stood up too quickly, the room tilted for a second before settling. I poured myself a glass of water and drank it slowly, hoping it would quiet the ache in my stomach, and I remember feeling embarrassed by how desperate that hope was. I checked my phone again, not for food this time, but for messages, scrolling through my recent calls as if I might have missed something, but there was nothing from my parents, no check-in, no casual question about how things were going. The absence felt heavier now that the card had failed, because it meant there was no backup plan forming on their end either. I considered calling my mother, then standing in the kitchen with the phone in my hand, and I even dialed part of her number before stopping, my thumb hovering over the last digit. I imagined her answering from somewhere bright and busy, her voice distracted, and I imagined myself trying to explain calmly that the card did not work, that I needed help, and the image made my stomach twist in a different way. I could already hear her response, the light laugh, the reassurance that I must be doing something wrong, the reminder that she was on vacation and that everything would be fine if I just figured it out. The thought of being dismissed made my chest ache more than hunger did, and so I hung up without completing the call, telling myself I would try again later when I had more information, when I could present the problem neatly instead of emotionally. I went back to the pantry and opened one of the cans, cutting my finger slightly in the process, and the sting surprised me, sharp enough to make me hiss softly in the empty kitchen. I wrapped my finger in a paper towel and stared at the small spot of blood soaking through, suddenly aware of how alone I was with even minor problems. There was no one to tell me it would be okay, no one to take over when something went wrong, and that awareness settled into me quietly but firmly. I heated the soup and ate it standing up, spooning it carefully, not because it tasted good, but because it was there, and as I ate, I felt my earlier confidence drain away, replaced by a more sober understanding of my situation. This was not a temporary inconvenience, not a test I could pass with effort alone. It was a slow unfolding of consequences that I had no control over. Afterward, I rinsed the bowl and set it in the sink, noticing how empty the counter looked without clutter, how little evidence there was of life continuing normally in the house. I sat at the table again and tried to distract myself with homework, but the numbers blurred on the page, my concentration slipping every time my stomach growled or the house creaked. Time moved differently that day, stretching and compressing in strange ways, and by the afternoon, I felt exhausted even though I had done very little. I lay down on the couch and stared at the ceiling, listening to the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second marking time. My mother was not thinking about me, and I felt something harden inside me then, not anger yet, but awareness. The technical failure of that card did more than prevent me from ordering food. It stripped away the story I had been telling myself about independence and revealed the truth beneath it, that I had been left without a functioning safety net. I did not cry when I understood this. I did not shout or throw anything because those reactions would have required energy I was already conserving. Instead, I lay there and stared at the ceiling, my mind replaying my mother's words in a new light, independent, now not a baby anymore. Just order food, and each phrase sounded less like encouragement and more like an excuse. That was the day the situation shifted from something I thought I could manage to something I knew I would have to document, even if I did not yet understand why, because some part of me recognized that when systems fail quietly, the only thing left is proof. By the fourth day, the hunger stopped being a background discomfort and became a presence that followed me from room to room, settling into my body with a dull persistence that made it harder to think clearly, and what frightened me most was how quickly it began to feel normal. I woke up that morning with my mouth dry and my stomach tight, a deep, aching emptiness that did not go away when I drank water, and for a few seconds I lay still in bed, hoping that if I did not move, the feeling might fade. It did not. Instead, it seemed to sharpen a steady reminder that my body needed something I could not easily provide. I moved slowly as I got up, noticing that my legs felt weak in a way they had not before, And when I stood too quickly, the room tilted and swayed, forcing me to grab the edge of my dresser until the dizziness passed. That small moment scared me more than anything else had so far, because it was physical proof that my situation was affecting me in ways I could not talk myself out of. In the kitchen, I opened the pantry again, though I already knew what I would find, and stared at the shelves as if something new might appear if I looked hard enough. The cereal box held only crumbs. Now the peanut butter jar was scraped clean and the soup cans were gone. I found a jar of pickles I hated and a box of crackers that tasted like cardboard, and I ate a few anyway, chewing slowly, forcing myself to swallow because I knew my body needed calories, even if my appetite had turned into something distant and unreliable. As I ate, I kept glancing at my phone, not because I expected it to ring, but because some part of me still believed that attention might arrive if I stayed alert enough. There was nothing. No missed calls, no messages, no check-ins. The silence from my parents had taken on a different quality now, heavier and more pointed, because it meant that days had passed without anyone wondering how I was doing. I tried to remind myself that my mother was busy, that Europe was far away, that time zones were confusing, but those explanations felt thin compared to the reality that she had not made space for me in her thoughts at all. That afternoon, I turned the television on again and let it play without caring what was on the sound filling the rooms, so I did not have to hear my own stomach growl or the way the house seemed to echo when I walked through it. I curled up on the couch with a blanket, even though it was warm outside, seeking comfort where I could find it, and I drifted in and out of sleep, my body heavy, my thoughts slow. When I woke up, I checked the clock and realized hours had passed, and panic flickered briefly because I had lost time without meaning to another reminder that I was not in control the way I had believed. I reached for my phone again and scrolled through social media, partly to distract myself and partly because I wanted to see my mother's face to confirm that she was still thinking of me somewhere. What I saw instead made something inside me tighten painfully. She had posted a photo from a cafe, smiling broadly, a croissant on the table in front of her, sunlight catching her hair just right, and the caption read, "Finally free for a month." The words felt like a slap, not because she was enjoying herself, but because the freedom she was celebrating came directly from my absence. I stared at that image for a long time, my fingers cold against the screen, and I felt a rush of emotions that I did not know how to separate. Anger, hurt, shame, for feeling angry at all. I wanted to comment to ask her if she remembered me, if she wondered what I was eating, but I did nothing because speaking up felt like crossing a line I had been trained not to cross. Instead, I turned the phone face down and focused on breathing until the tightness in my chest eased slightly. That evening, I tried to make something resembling dinner-crushing crackers into a bowl and adding water to soften them, telling myself it was temporary, that people survived worse, that I was being dramatic. The words sounded hollow even as I thought them, and I noticed that my hands were shaking again, making it hard to hold the bowl steady. I sat at the table alone, the chair across from me empty, and for the first time, I felt a wave of sadness that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with being unseen. It is one thing to be hungry when someone knows and cannot help it, is another to be hungry when no one knows at all. That night, I went to bed early again, my body tired in a way that sleep did not fully fix, and I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the neighborhood outside. A car passing a dog, barking, distant laughter drifting in through an open window. Normal life was continuing all around me, and I was sealed off from it inside my own house. A child quietly managing a situation no child should have been placed in. By the fifth day, the hunger had changed my relationship with time, entirely stretching minutes into hours and making the simplest tasks feel exhausting. I moved carefully now, aware that sudden movements made me dizzy, and I found myself sitting down often, not because I wanted to, but because my body insisted. I drank water constantly, hoping it would trick my stomach into settling, and I told myself that if I could just get through another day, maybe something would change. That hope felt thinner with each passing hour. I checked my phone again and again, and when there was still nothing, I began to feel something shift inside me. A quiet anger that did not explode outward but turned inward, sharpening my awareness. I started to notice details I had ignored before, the way the trash can held only a few wrappers. The way the fridge light shone on empty shelves, the way the calendar on the wall still had the date circled for my mother's departure, as if marking the moment everything began to unravel. I realized then that if something happened to me, if I fainted or got hurt, or simply disappeared into the background of my own life, there would be very little to explain why. No one would be able to look at the house and understand the slow erosion that had taken place, the days of silence, the meals that never happened, the calls that were never made. That thought scared me more than the hunger itself, because it meant that my experience could vanish without a trace, dismissed later as exaggeration or misunderstanding. It was around that time that I began to think about writing things down, not yet as a plan, but as a reflex, a way to hold on to what was happening, so it did not slip away unnoticed. I found my notebook on my desk and flipped through it, the pages mostly filled with school notes and doodles, and I stared at the blank space at the back, feeling a strange pull toward it. I did not write anything yet, but the idea lodged itself firmly in my mind that recording might matter, that memory alone might not be enough. Hunger has a way of clarifying priorities, and in that foggy, weakened state, I understood something fundamental, that the silence surrounding me was not neutral, it was active. It was doing harm by allowing everything else to continue as if nothing were wrong. The longer my parents stayed silent, the heavier that silence became, pressing down on me with the weight of neglect. By the end of the 5th day, I was no longer pretending that this was a test I could pass with effort and optimism, and I was no longer comforted by the idea that my mother believed in my independence. What I felt instead was the slow realization that being unnoticed was dangerous, that quiet endurance did not protect me, and that if this situation continued without intervention, there would be nothing to mark what I had been through except what I chose to preserve myself. The idea did not arrive fully formed. It crept in quietly, the way exhaustion does, settling into my thoughts until it felt inevitable, because by the 6th day, survival had stopped feeling like something I could muscle through and started feeling like something that needed witnesses. I sat at my desk with the notebook open in front of me, the blank pages suddenly heavy with possibility, and for a long moment I simply stared at them, my pen resting between my fingers as if it were waiting for permission. I remember thinking that writing things down felt dramatic, that it was something people did in movies, not something an 11-year-old did in a quiet house on an ordinary weekday. And yet the longer I sat there, the more certain I became that memory alone would not be enough. Hunger has a way of sharpening the mind even as it weakens the body, and in that strange clarity, I understood that if I did not capture what was happening, it could be rewritten later by people who were better at telling stories than I was. My mother was very good at telling stories. She could turn a problem into a misunderstanding, a mistake into a learning experience, absence into independence, and I had seen her do it too many times to trust that the truth would survive on its own. I flipped to a clean page near the back of the notebook and wrote one word at the top in careful block letters: evidence. The pen pressing harder into the paper than I intended, leaving a faint impression on the page beneath. Seeing the word there made my chest tighten, not with fear, but with a strange sense of resolve, because naming it changed the way I thought about everything that followed. This was no longer a diary meant to soothe feelings, it was a record meant to endure. I wrote the date first, then how many days my parents had been gone, then the amount of money they had left me. $20 written out clearly so there could be no confusion. I listed the credit card and wrote next to it, "Does not work." Tried multiple times, and even as I wrote that line, I felt a flicker of shame, as if admitting failure were a personal flaw instead of a technical fact. I kept going anyway, because stopping would have meant turning back, and I was already too far into this new way of seeing things to pretend it did not matter. I wrote about the food in the house, what was left and what was gone, the cereal crumbs, the crackers, the pickles I hated, and as I wrote, I realized how quickly the details added up into something undeniable. This was not one bad meal or one missed call, it was a pattern forming in ink. My hand shook as I wrote, partly from hunger and partly from the weight of what I was doing, because some part of me knew that once this existed, it could not be unseen. I paused and listened to the house around me, the familiar sounds now tinged with something else. The hum of the refrigerator like a witness itself, the distant traffic outside, reminding me that the world was moving on without me. I picked up my phone next, my fingers cold against the glass, and opened the camera app. my heart beating faster as if I were about to do something forbidden. I had never recorded myself like that before, never spoken into a camera without someone telling me what to say, and the thought made me hesitate. I imagined my mother finding the video later, her face tightening with disbelief or anger, and for a moment, fear surged strongly enough to make me consider putting the phone down. Then another thought cut through it quieter but steadier, that if I did not speak now, I might never be able to explain later how it felt to be this small and this alone. I set the phone on my desk, propping it against a stack of books so it would not fall, and when I saw my own face on the screen, it startled me. I looked smaller than I felt, my eyes too large for my face shadows under them I had not noticed before, and the sight made my throat tighten. I took a breath and began, my voice soft at first, then steadier as the words came out. I said the day 6, and I said that I was alone, that my parents were in Europe, that the credit card did not work, that I was hungry. And as I spoke, I realized that saying it out loud changed it from a private worry into a statement of fact. I did not cry in the video, not because I was not sad, but because I was focused on being clear on saying things exactly as they were, so no one could later accuse me of exaggeration. I turned the camera slightly and showed the kitchen, the empty shelves, the light in the refrigerator illuminating more space than food, and my voice wavered. Then, not with tears, but with effort, because moving made me dizzy and I had to lean against the counter to steady myself. When I finished recording, I stopped the video and sat down heavily in the chair, my heart pounding, my hands trembling, and for a moment I felt exposed in a way I never had before. That exposure was followed almost immediately by something else, a small but powerful sense of relief, because the burden of holding everything inside had shifted, even if only slightly, onto the page and the screen. I saved the video and locked my phone, tucking it into my backpack alongside the notebook, and the physical act of putting those things together made it feel official, as if I were assembling a kit for a situation I could no longer deny. The rest of that day passed in a haze, my body moving slowly, my thoughts looping back to the word at the top of the page, evidence, and what it meant for an 11-year-old to need such a thing. I checked my phone again that afternoon, not with hope anymore, but with curiosity, wondering how long the silence would last and when there was still nothing. I added another line to the notebook, no calls, no messages, day 6. Writing it down transformed the absence into something measurable, something that could be counted instead of felt. As evening came on, I tried to eat what little remained, forcing myself to chew, slowly aware that my stomach seemed to have shrunk, that even small amounts made me feel uncomfortably full and yet unsatisfied. I drank water and lay down on the couch again, the notebook resting on my chest, the pen tucked into the spiral, and I stared at the ceiling, thinking about how strange it was that the most adult thing I had done so far was not cooking or budgeting, but documenting. When I fell asleep that night, it was shallow and restless, my dreams fragmented, filled with images of doors that would not open and phones that would not ring, and when I woke in the early morning hours, I reached instinctively for the notebook, touching it as if to reassure myself that it was still there. At 27, I can see how pivotal that day was, how the act of recording shifted the trajectory of everything that followed. But at 11, I only knew that something inside me had changed. Survival was no longer enough, because survival without acknowledgement felt like erasure, and I was no longer willing to disappear quietly into a story someone else could rewrite. The notebook and the videos did not give me food or comfort, but they gave me something just as essential in that moment, a way to assert that what was happening was real, that it mattered, and that if help ever came, it would find a record waiting. If hunger was what weakened my body, shame was what kept me isolated, because by the 7th day, the physical symptoms were no longer the hardest part. It was the constant negotiation in my head about whether I was allowed to need anyone at all. I woke up that morning with a dull headache and a heaviness behind my eyes, the kind that made light feel too bright and sound feel too sharp. And I lay still for a long time, staring at the wall, listening to my own breathing as if it belonged to someone else. My first instinct was to reach for my phone, not to check the time, but to check whether anything had changed while I slept, whether someone had remembered me overnight, and when I saw that there were still no messages, a familiar tightness wrapped itself around my chest. I told myself not to be dramatic, a phrase I had heard so often that it surfaced automatically, and I forced myself out of bed, moving slowly so the dizziness would not catch me off guard. In the kitchen, I went through the motions of looking for food, even though I knew there was nothing new to find, opening the refrigerator, closing it, standing in front of the pantry with my arms crossed, as if posture could substitute for options. I ate a few crackers and drank water, then sat at the table with my head in my hands, waiting for the nausea to pass. It did eventually, but it left behind a hollow feeling that was less about hunger and more about loneliness, the kind that comes from realizing you are handling something alone that should never have been yours to manage. That was the morning I seriously considered telling someone outside my family what was happening, and the fact that it took me that long says everything about how deeply the shame had been planted. I thought first of my best friend Emma, the person I talked to about everything at school, and I picked up my phone and opened our message thread, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I imagined typing the truth that my parents were gone, that I was alone, that I was hungry and scared, and the image made my throat tighten. Telling Emma would mean admitting that my family was not what I pretended it was, that the independence my mother bragged about had a cost, and that felt like a betrayal, even though I was the one being hurt. I typed a message that sounded normal instead, something safe and casual, asking how her trip was going because I remembered she had gone to a lake with her family that weekend. I stared at the message for a few seconds before hitting send, already feeling a familiar mix of relief and disappointment. Relief because I had not exposed myself, disappointment because I had not been honest. When there was no reply right away, I told myself she was busy, that it did not mean anything, but the absence still stung, reinforcing the sense that my life had shrunk to the size of the rooms in my house. I considered texting another friend, then another, and each time I stopped myself, the same thoughts looping through my mind that I did not want to worry anyone, that I did not want to cause trouble, that I did not want people to think badly of my parents. That last thought surprised me even then, because it revealed how my loyalty was still oriented outward, protecting the adults who had left me rather than myself. I had been taught implicitly and explicitly that family problems were private, that involving outsiders was a kind of failure, and those lessons were doing their work, now keeping my situation contained even as it worsened. I thought briefly about my teachers about Mr. Cooper at school, and the idea made my stomach twist, not because I did not trust him, but because telling an adult with authority would make the situation real in a way I could not control. If I spoke up, things would move, questions would be asked, and I would no longer be able to manage the narrative quietly. That loss of control felt terrifying, especially after days of clinging to the idea that I could handle this if I just stayed calm. Shame thrives in that fear, convincing you that silence is safer than uncertainty. And at 11, I did not yet have the experience to challenge that belief. Instead, I turned back to the notebook, flipping through the pages I had written the day before, and I read my own words, slowly taking in the dates, the lists, the simple statements of fact. Seeing them written down gave me a strange sense of grounding because the notebook did not judge me for being hungry or alone, it simply recorded it. I added a new line under the previous entry day. 7 still no calls, still alone, and the act of writing felt easier now, less dramatic, more necessary. If I could not yet bring myself to speak to someone, at least I could continue to document, continue to make the situation visible on paper. The rest of that day passed in a quiet haze, my energy low, my thoughts looping, and I found myself sitting by the front window, more often watching the street, as if expecting someone to appear. I saw neighbors come and go, parents loading groceries into cars, kids riding bikes. Ordinary scenes that felt almost surreal compared to the stillness inside my house. Each time a car slowed near our driveway, my heart jumped briefly, then sank when it moved on, and I felt foolish for hoping, ashamed of how much I wanted to be noticed. That shame followed me everywhere, coloring even my most basic needs with a sense of failure, as if needing help meant I had not tried hard enough on my own. In the afternoon, I lay down on the living room floor because the couch made my head spin, pressing my cheek against the cool surface and focusing on my breathing until the dizziness passed. As I lay there, I thought about my mother's voice, about how she praised me for being easy, for not making a fuss, and I realized how deeply that praise had shaped me. Being easy meant being quiet. Being mature meant handling things alone. Being independent meant not asking for help even when you needed it. Those messages had felt like compliments when I was younger, but now they revealed themselves as constraints keeping me from reaching out, even when reaching out might save me. I wondered what would happen if I fainted, if I fell and hurt myself, if I simply stopped getting up, and the thought scared me enough to sit up abruptly despite the dizziness. I looked around the room at the furniture, the walls, the familiar objects that had always represented safety, and I felt a wave of anger rise beneath the shame. Anger at the situation, at the silence, at the way I had been conditioned to handle this alone. That anger did not explode outward. It settled into something quieter but more determined, a sense that this could not continue indefinitely without consequences. As evening approached, I forced myself to eat a few more crackers, chewing carefully, aware that my body felt fragile in a way it never had before. I drank more water and sat at the table with the notebook open, rereading what I had written, and for the first time I imagined someone else reading it someday. The image was frightening and comforting at the same time, frightening because it meant exposure, comforting because it meant not being alone in the truth anymore. I still did not send any honest messages that day, still did not call anyone, and that choice would later haunt me in small ways, but it was also part of the process that led me where I needed to go. Shame kept me silent, but it also sharpened my awareness of how wrong the situation was, how much effort it took to maintain the appearance of independence, when the reality was neglect. At 27, I can look back on that day with compassion for the child I was, understanding that silence was not a failure of character, but a learned response to a family system that punished need. I did not ask for help yet, but the question had finally taken shape in my mind, hovering there insistently, waiting for the moment when the cost of silence would outweigh the fear of speaking. The knock came late in the afternoon, soft at first, and then firmer, 3 measured taps that cut through the quiet of the house with a precision that made my heart jump into my throat. For a second, I did not move at all, frozen in the living room with the notebook open on my lap and the pen resting across the page, because no one ever knocked on our door like that. Friends knocked in uneven rhythms, delivery drivers knocked once and left packages on the step, but this was different. Deliberate, followed by the doorbell chiming in a polite, insistent way that suggested the person on the other side expected an answer. I stood up too quickly, and the room swayed, forcing me to grab the arm of the couch until the dizziness passed, and as I steadied myself, I felt a surge of fear that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with exposure. If I opened the door, the situation would no longer belong only to me. If I did not open it, I would still be alone, still hungry, still responsible for keeping everything hidden. The decision pressed down on me with surprising weight for something that should have been simple, and I realized how deeply I had internalized the idea that being seen was dangerous. The knock came again, firmer this time, followed by a voice calling my name, Hannah, in a tone that was gentle, but unmistakably adult. Hearing my name spoken by someone outside the house jolted me forward because it meant this was not a stranger and not a mistake. I walked toward the door slowly, my steps careful, my breath shallow, and as I reached for the handle, I considered pretending I was not home, letting the person leave, preserving the fragile control I still had. Then another thought surfaced, quieter but more urgent. What if this was the moment someone finally noticed that I was alone? I cracked the door open just enough to see who was there, my fingers tight around the edge, ready to close it if I needed to. Standing on the porch was Mr. Alan Cooper, the school counselor, 61 years old, wearing a green jacket with the school emblem stitched on the chest. His posture relaxed, but his eyes focused in a way that made it clear he was paying attention to details. It took me a second to place him outside the context of school, without a desk or a hallway behind him, and that hesitation must have shown on my face because he smiled gently and said my name again, as if to reassure me that I was not in trouble. He explained that he had been trying to reach my parents all week, that emails and calls had gone unanswered, and that when that happened, the school had a responsibility to check in. His words washed over me in a blur. Responsibility check and reach your parents. And with each phrase, something inside me loosened slightly because his presence confirmed that the silence I had been living in was not normal, that someone else had noticed it too. He asked if he could come in for a moment, and my first instinct was to say no to protect the fragile order I had built, but my body moved before my fear could stop it stepping back to let him inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the house seemed to change, the quiet thickening in a way that made the space feel exposed rather than empty, and I watched his eyes take in the details I had grown used to ignoring. The empty counter, the sink with only one bowl, the fruit bowl holding nothing but a single bruised apple. I had been saving the refrigerator light spilling onto shelves that looked more like storage than nourishment. He did not say anything at first, and that silence was different from my parents' silence because it was attentive rather than absent. He asked where my parents were, and when I told him they were in Europe for a month, his eyebrows lifted slightly, a brief flash of surprise he did not try to hide. He asked who was staying with me, and the words caught in my throat for a moment before I answered honestly, just me. Saying it out loud made it real in a way nothing else had, and I felt my face flush with heat, a mix of embarrassment and relief. He asked how long I had been alone, and when I told him nearly a week, his expression changed subtly, concern sharpening into something more serious. He pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and motioned for me to sit across from him, and the simple act of sitting down with an adult who was listening made my chest ache unexpectedly. He asked about food, about money, about how I had been managing, and each question felt like a door opening onto something I had kept closed. I answered carefully at first, minimizing without fully lying, but when he asked if I had enough to eat, a short bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it, surprising us both. I told him about the $20 about the credit card that did not work, and about trying to stretch what little we had, and as I spoke, I felt the weight of the last 7 days pressing up against my ribs, demanding release. He listened without interrupting, his attention steady, and when I finished, he leaned back slightly and said quietly that this was not okay, that leaving an 11-year-old alone for that long without supervision or adequate resources was dangerous. Hearing an adult name it that way sent a shock through me because until that moment, I had been framing the situation as a test of my resilience rather than a failure of their responsibility. He used the word neglect carefully, as if aware of its power, and the word echoed in my head, heavy and unfamiliar. I asked what that meant. What would happen if someone found out, and his answer was measured, honest, not softened for my comfort. He explained that there were laws that agencies existed to protect children in situations like this, that an investigation could follow, and as he spoke, I felt a strange mix of fear and vindication. Fear because consequences sounded serious and uncontrollable. Vindication because it meant I had not imagined the wrongness of what was happening. When he asked if I wanted help, real help, not just groceries, the question hung in the air between us, charged with possibility. I hesitated because saying yes would mean crossing a line I had been taught to fear, exposing my family to scrutiny, relinquishing the last scraps of control I felt I had. At the same time, saying no would mean returning to the quiet endurance that had already taken so much from me. I glanced at the notebook on the table, the word evidence visible at the top of the page, and something settled inside me. Then a recognition that this was not just about getting through the week, but about what happened next. I told him yes, that I wanted help, and my voice shook but did not break. He nodded once decisively and said the first priority was making sure I was safe, that he would make some calls, and that he would stay with me while we figured out the next steps. As he stepped into the hallway to speak on his phone, I sat at the table with my notebook open, listening to fragments of his conversation words like alone 11, no supervision drifting back to me, and for the first time since my mother left, I felt something shift in the house. The silence was no longer mine to carry alone. The arrival of authority did not feel dramatic at first, it felt procedural, and that difference mattered because procedure has a way of stripping away excuses and leaving only facts behind. Mr. Alan Cooper returned from the hallway with his expression carefully neutral, the kind of calm adults adopt when they are making decisions that will affect other people's lives, and he told me he had called a neighbor he trusted and a child protection hotline to report what he had found. The words report and hotline landed heavily in my chest, not because I did not believe they were necessary, but because they carried a finality that could not be undone once spoken. He assured me that the goal was safety, not punishment, and I nodded, even though my thoughts were racing ahead to images I could not yet fully picture. A few minutes later, there was another knock quieter than the first, and Mrs. Eleanor Brooks stepped inside, her silver hair pulled back neatly, her eyes scanning the room with the practiced awareness of someone who had raised children in a time when neighbors paid attention. She was 68 and moved with a steadiness that felt grounding, and when she looked at me, her face softened in a way that made my throat tighten unexpectedly. She did not ask why I had not come to her sooner. She did not scold or question. She simply said my name and asked if I was hungry, and the simplicity of that question almost broke me. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment, and she squeezed my shoulder gently, as if to say that was enough, that she understood. While Mr. Cooper explained the situation to her in low tones, she walked through the kitchen, opening the refrigerator, peering into the pantry, taking in the details I had cataloged for days, and each quiet nod felt like validation rather than judgment. When the caseworker arrived not long after introducing herself as Linda Morales, 45, her presence brought a different kind of gravity into the room. She was professional without being cold, her voice steady, her questions precise, and she explained clearly who she was and why she was there, emphasizing that my safety was her priority. She asked to see where I slept, what I had been eating, how long my parents had been gone, and as I answered, I felt the strange relief of not having to convince anyone that this was serious. The facts spoke for themselves. She took photographs of the refrigerator and pantry, documenting the empty shelves and expired items, and she asked about money, about the credit card, about contact with my parents. I handed her my phone with shaking hands, scrolling to show her the call log that listed only one outgoing attempt and no incoming calls, and I felt a flicker of shame even then, as if their absence reflected on me rather than them. She examined the emergency card and confirmed what I had already learned the hard way, that it was not activated and could not be used without an adult setting it up. And hearing that stated plainly by someone in authority sent a rush of heat through my face, anger mixing with relief. Mrs. Brooks spoke up then, her voice firm but calm, telling the caseworker that she had seen me looking pale and unsteady earlier in the week, that I had not come to her because I had been taught to handle things on my own, and her words landed with a weight that surprised me. It was one thing for me to say I was hungry and alone. It was another for an adult neighbor to confirm that she had noticed the effects. Ms. Morales nodded and made notes, her pen moving steadily, and she asked me if I had written anything down about the days my parents were gone. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, then reached into my backpack and pulled out the notebook, placing it on the table with the word evidence facing up. The room went quiet as she read the entries, her eyes moving line by line, and I watched her face carefully searching for disbelief or dismissal. But what I saw instead was concentration. She asked permission to take photographs of the pages, and when I nodded, she did so methodically, treating my handwriting with the same seriousness she treated the photographs of the empty fridge. She asked if I had recorded anything else, and my heart pounded as I unlocked my phone and showed her the videos, my own small voice filling the kitchen as it played, stating facts I had been careful to keep measured. Hearing myself from a few days earlier made my chest ache, but it also confirmed something important, that I had been clear, that I had not exaggerated, that the truth was already complete. Ms. Morales thanked me for documenting a phrase I had never expected to hear applied to something I did out of fear, and she explained that documentation helped ensure accuracy when emotions ran high. She told me that based on what she had seen and heard, the situation met the criteria for neglect under state law, and while her tone remained calm, the words carried undeniable weight. Neglect was no longer a concept, it was a determination. She explained the immediate steps that would follow, that I would not remain alone, that a temporary placement would be arranged while they contacted my parents and assessed the situation further. As she spoke, I felt a complicated mix of sensations: relief that the days of isolation were ending, fear of what my parents would say when they learned what was happening, and a quiet satisfaction that the truth had reached people who could not simply dismiss it. Mrs. Brooks offered to have me stay with her and Ms. Morales accepted the offer after confirming her suitability, explaining the process in clear, respectful terms that made it feel less like a punishment and more like a plan. While they talked, Mr. Cooper quietly went to the kitchen and began making phone calls, arranging food, notifying the school, coordinating logistics, and the efficiency of it all contrasted sharply with the chaos of the previous week. When groceries arrived and Mrs. Brooks unpacked them methodically, laying out pasta, vegetables, breadfruit, things that would last, the kitchen began to look like a place where someone lived again, and that visual change made my eyes sting unexpectedly. Ms. Morales asked if I had heard from my parents at all since they left, and when I told her about the single photo from Paris with the caption "finally free for a month," she asked me to show it to her. She studied the image carefully, noting the date and time, and wrote something down without comment, but the quiet way she did it made the significance clear. She explained that they would attempt to contact my parents immediately, that they would be informed of the investigation, and that their return plans might change as a result. The word investigation echoed in my head heavy, but strangely validating, because it meant the situation was being taken seriously, not smoothed over or minimized. Before leaving, Ms. Morales asked if there was anything else I wanted to add to the record, anything I felt was important for her to understand, and I thought for a moment before answering. I told her about the way independence had been used as a compliment in my house, about how asking for help was treated as weakness, and as I spoke, I realized how much that context mattered, how it explained my silence as well as my hunger. She listened attentively and thanked me again, telling me that my voice mattered and that it was okay to let adults handle what should never have been placed on me. When she finally left, promising to return soon with updates, the house felt different, not lighter exactly, but less oppressive, as if the walls had stopped closing in. Mrs. Brooks helped me pack a small bag, and as I gathered my clothes and the notebook and my phone, I looked around my room with a strange sense of detachment, aware that when my parents returned, this space would not hold the same meaning. As we walked across the short stretch of grass to her house carrying my bag between us, I felt the weight of the past week settle into something like resolve. The truth had met authority, and it had not been softened or excused, and for the first time since my mother left, I understood that what happened next would be shaped not by my silence, but by the record I had created. Preparation did not look like rehearsal or raised voices or adults whispering plans behind closed doors. It looked like papers being stacked carefully, dates being highlighted, phones being charged and placed face down on the table. And in that quiet efficiency, I began to understand that what was coming was not an argument, but an accounting. The next 2 days passed in a strange suspended state while my parents' flights were moved up and the investigation continued. And during that time, I stayed with Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, whose house smelled consistently of clean laundry and warm food. Small details that felt almost unreal after the hollow quiet of my own home. She moved through her routines with a steadiness that made space for me without asking me to perform gratitude, and each morning she asked how I slept and waited for the answer instead of assuming it would be fine. Those questions alone felt like a recalibration of what normal could be. At the same time, the weight of what was coming sat constantly at the back of my mind, a low hum of anticipation and dread that followed me through meals, homework, and restless nights. Ms. Linda Morales checked in regularly, updating us in a clear and measured way that left little room for speculation, explaining that my parents had been notified and that their return had been expedited not because they were concerned about me, but because they were concerned about what the investigation could mean for them. That distinction mattered, and hearing it stated plainly stripped away the last of my illusions. Mr. Allen Cooper coordinated with the school, ensuring that my absence was explained without exposing more than necessary, and when he spoke to me privately, he emphasized that I had done nothing wrong, that adults were responsible for managing adult choices, and that my job now was simply to stay safe. Those words should have been comforting, and they were. But they also highlighted how long I had been carrying responsibilities that did not belong to me. The day before my parents were due to arrive, Ms. Morales came to the house with a thick folder under her arm, its weight visible even before she set it on the table. She explained that this was the compiled record so far, my statements, the photographs, the documentation of the non-functional credit card, the call logs, the neighbor testimony, and that everything inside it would form the basis of the initial determination. She spoke carefully, not to overwhelm me, but not to hide the seriousness either. and she asked if I wanted to add a written statement in my own words to be included. The request made my hands tremble slightly because it felt like a final step, a moment of clarity that could not be taken back, and I took a deep breath before nodding. Mrs. Brooks brought me my notebook and a fresh sheet of paper, and I sat at the kitchen table with the pen poised above the page, aware that what I wrote would be read by people who did not know me, people whose decisions would shape what happened next. I wrote slowly, choosing my words carefully, not to soften the truth, but to keep it precise. I wrote about being told I was independent, about being left alone without a plan, about the hunger that crept in day by day, about the silence that made everything worse, and about the fear of asking for help because I had been taught that needing help meant failing. I made it clear that I was not trying to punish my parents, that I was trying to be safe. And when I finished, I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes from saying exactly what you mean without apology. Nah. Morales read the statement and thanked me, placing it carefully into the folder as if it were something valuable, and in that moment, I understood that my words carried weight beyond my family now. That afternoon, we went back to my house to prepare the space for the meeting, and walking through the front door again made my chest tighten, even though I knew I would not be alone this time. The house looked the same on the surface, but everything felt different, the rooms echoing with memory, the kitchen bearing the marks of the past week in ways I could not unsee. Ms. Morales directed the setup with quiet authority, choosing the kitchen table as the place where the conversation would happen, explaining that neutral spaces were better for difficult discussions. The folder was placed at the center of the table, my notebook set beside it with the word evidence clearly visible, and my phone was positioned, so the first video I had recorded was paused on the screen, my younger face staring back with a seriousness that startled me even now. Seeing it there made my stomach flip, but it also grounded me, a reminder of why we were doing this. Mrs. Brooks stood near the doorway, her presence both protective and unobtrusive, while Mr. Cooper leaned against the counter, his posture relaxed, but his attention sharp, and Ms. Morales took a seat at the table, reviewing the contents of the folder one last time. She asked me if I was comfortable being present when my parents arrived, emphasizing that it was my choice and that I could step out at any time, and I considered the option carefully. Part of me wanted to avoid the confrontation entirely, to let the adults handle it while I stayed somewhere safe. But another part of me, the part that had written evidence at the top of a page, knew that disappearing now would feel like erasing myself all over again. I told her I wanted to be there, that I wanted them to see me, and she nodded, acknowledging the decision without praise or judgment. We went over what would happen in practical terms, that she would lead the conversation, that my parents would be informed of the findings so far, that emotions might run high, and that if at any point I felt overwhelmed, I could look to her or Mrs. Brooks or Mr. Cooper for support. Those assurances mattered, creating a framework where I did not have to manage the adults' reactions on my own. As the time drew closer, the air in the house felt charged, not with anger, but with inevitability, and I found myself focusing on small details to stay grounded. The feel of the chair beneath me, the sound of the clock ticking on the wall, the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I thought about my mother walking through the door with her suitcase, expecting a quiet house and a compliant child, and the contrast between that expectation and the reality waiting for her made my heart pound. I thought about my father following behind her, likely hoping to smooth things over, to frame it as a misunderstanding, and I wondered how he would react when the evidence made that impossible. Waiting for them felt like standing at the edge of something irreversible, and in that waiting, I understood that the outcome was no longer about convincing anyone of my experience. It was about allowing the truth to stand on its own. When the sound of tires crunching on the driveway finally reached us, every adult in the room straightened slightly, and Ms. Morales met my eyes, her expression steady, reminding me without words that I was not alone. I took a slow breath and placed my hands flat on the table, feeling the solid surface beneath my palms, anchoring myself to the present. The room was ready, the record was complete, and whatever happened next would be shaped not by fear or silence, but by the evidence laid out in plain sight. The sound of the car doors slamming outside carried through the house with a sharp finality that made my shoulders tense before I could stop myself, and in that instant I felt the full weight of the moment settle into my body, heavy and undeniable. I did not move from my seat at the kitchen table, even though every instinct told me to stand up to brace myself to prepare for impact, because Ms. Linda Morales had explained that staying where I was would help keep the conversation anchored in facts rather than emotion. The front door opened and my mother, Margaret Reed, stepped inside, first pulling her suitcase behind her, like she always did. Her posture confident, her sunglasses still perched on top of her head, as if she had not yet fully transitioned out of vacation mode. My father, David Reed, followed close behind, juggling bags and muttering something about jet lag, his voice light in a way that felt painfully out of place. Their conversation stopped abruptly when they saw us. The laughter drained from my father's face, and my mother's practiced smile froze halfway, her eyes darting from Ms. Morales at the table to Mr. Alan Cooper by the counter, to Mrs. Eleanor Brooks standing quietly near the doorway, and finally landing on me sitting stiffly with my hands folded in front of me. For a moment, no one spoke, the silence, thick and electric, and then my mother's voice cut through it, sharp and demanding, as she asked what all these people were doing in her kitchen. Ms. Morales introduced herself calmly, identifying her role with Child Protective Services, and asking both of my parents to have a seat so they could discuss the situation regarding their daughter. My mother did not sit right away. She stared at me instead, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if she were trying to assess how much trouble she was in and how much control she still had. She asked me directly what I had told them, her tone tight with accusation, and the old reflex flared inside me that urged to minimize, to apologize, to make it easier for her to accept what was happening. That reflex died quickly when I glanced at my phone on the table, the paused image of my younger face staring back at me, a reminder of why I was there. I lifted my chin and said that I had told them the truth. My father stepped in, then attempting to smooth things over with a strained laugh, explaining that there must have been a misunderstanding, that I was a very mature child, that they had left me with food and money and trusted me to handle myself. As he spoke, my mother finally sat down, crossing her arms defensively, her foot tapping lightly against the floor. Ms. Morales listened without interrupting her expression, neutral, and when my father finished, she reached into the folder and pulled out the activation record for the emergency credit card, sliding it across the table toward them. She explained in a clear, even tone that the card had never been activated, that it required an adult to set a PIN, and that it had been declined multiple times when I tried to use it. My mother's mouth opened slightly as if to protest, then closed again as she stared at the paper. Ms. Morales continued placing photographs of the refrigerator and pantry on the table, images taken 1 week into their trip that showed empty shelves and expired items. My mother snapped that expired food did not mean I was starving, that they had only been gone a week so far, and that I was exaggerating. Ms. Morales slid another document forward, the call and message logs from my phone, showing one outgoing attempt and no incoming calls or texts after the airport photo. She pointed out the timestamps, calmly noting that there had been no direct check-ins asking if I had eaten or if anyone was staying with me. My father's face drained of color as he looked at the logs, his eyes flicking between the papers and me. He said quietly that they had told me to order food, that they trusted me, and the words landed differently now, stripped of their protective tone. Mrs. Brooks stepped forward, then her voice firm but controlled, and told them that she had found me dizzy from hunger, that there was almost nothing left in the house, and that I had not come to her sooner because I did not want to disappoint them by needing help. Hearing my experience reflected back by another adult made my mother's composure crack slightly, her hand rising to her mouth as if to physically block the words. She muttered that this was getting blown out of proportion, that I had always liked to write, implying that my notebook was just dramatics. Ms. Morales nodded once and turned her attention to me, asking if I was comfortable sharing what I had recorded. My hands shook as I reached for the phone, but I pressed play anyway. The room filled with my own small voice from days earlier, stating the day, explaining that I was alone, that the card did not work, that I had eaten the last decent thing in the fridge. The video panned across the kitchen, lingering on the empty shelves, the quiet rooms, and as it played, my mother let out a soft, broken sound and stepped back as if the images were physically pushing her away. My father stared at the screen, his shoulders slumping, the reality settling in despite his earlier attempts to reframe it. When the video ended, the silence that followed was different from any I had experienced before. Heavy, not with neglect, but with consequence. Ms. Morales folded her hands on the table and spoke clearly, explaining that based on the investigation, including school reports, neighbor testimony documentation, and my own recordings, the situation met the legal definition of neglect under state law. She explained that an emergency order would be put in place immediately, that I would not return to unsupervised care with either parent until a full hearing could be conducted, and that supervised visitation and mandatory evaluations would be part of the process. My mother shook her head violently, tears spilling as she insisted that they had not meant to hurt me, that they had just needed a break, that adults needed time away too. My father reached for her hand, his grip tight, his voice quiet as he said, "They had thought I would be fine." Something in me steadied, then a calm clarity cutting through the emotional noise, and I spoke before I could second-guess myself. I said that they always told me actions had consequences, that if I made a choice, I had to live with what came next, and that this was what their choice looked like. The words did not come out angry, they came out level, and that seemed to affect them more than shouting would have. My mother looked at me with a mixture of shock and grief, as if she were seeing me clearly for the first time and not liking what she saw reflected back. She asked me to tell them I wanted to come home, to say we could fix this, that we could start over, and for a moment, the old longing stirred the desire for the parents I wished I had rather than the ones I did. That longing passed when I thought about the nights alone, the hunger, the silence, and I said that I wanted to be safe, that I wanted to be somewhere I was seen, and that right now, that was not with them. Ms. Morales placed the temporary placement order on the table and explained the next steps in a voice that did not waver, outlining the conditions for contact and the upcoming court date. My mother whispered that they were taking my side over hers, and I corrected her quietly, saying they were finally taking my side. When we left the house that evening, walking back across the grass to Mrs. Brooks' home, I felt both exhausted and strangely lighter, because for the first time, the story was no longer something my parents could rewrite. The evidence had spoken, authority had listened, and the truth had taken its place at the center of the room where it could not be ignored. The weeks that followed did not feel like a victory lap or a dramatic resolution. They felt like a slow recalibration of reality, because when consequences are real, they arrive with paperwork and schedules and limits rather than applause. I stayed with Mrs. Eleanor Brooks under the temporary placement order, and the first nights there were strange in a way I had not expected, not frightening but unfamiliar, as if my body did not yet trust the absence of danger. Her guest room smelled faintly of soap and clean cotton, and the bed felt too soft at first. My muscles tense out of habit, as if I were still listening for the house to creak or the refrigerator to hum in warning. Each morning she knocked gently before opening the door and waited for me to answer a small courtesy that felt enormous after the week I had spent managing myself in silence. She cooked breakfast without comment, setting out real food in portions that did not require calculation, and she sat with me while I ate, not watching closely, not asking me to hurry, simply sharing the space in a way that allowed my body to remember what regular nourishment felt like. Those early days were a mixture of relief and grief. Relief because the immediate danger had passed, grief because safety made the absence of my parents feel more final rather than less. Ms. Linda Morales checked in frequently, explaining the process in clear terms, answering my questions honestly, and reminding me repeatedly that none of this was my responsibility to manage. She told me that my parents had been assigned supervised visitation, only that they would be required to complete parenting classes and psychological evaluations, and that any contact would be arranged through the department until the court made a determination. Hearing those words settled something inside me, because they were boundaries set by someone other than me, boundaries I did not have to enforce or defend. My parents sent messages through the proper channels, long explanations about misunderstandings and stress and how much they loved me, and Ms. Morales reviewed them carefully before sharing them, ensuring that nothing manipulative or guilt-driven reached me. That layer of protection mattered more than I realized at the time, because it gave me space to think without being pulled back into old patterns. I returned to school under a modified schedule, and Mr. Alan Cooper made a point of checking in with me privately, not to interrogate, but to ensure continuity, to make sure that the adult systems around me were communicating the way they should have from the beginning. When classmates asked questions, the school provided neutral explanations, and I learned quickly that privacy could be preserved without lies, that it was possible to be protected without pretending nothing had happened. At home, with Mrs. Brooks, routines formed: gently homework at the kitchen table, dinner at a regular hour, quiet evenings where conversation was optional rather than required, and those routines began to stitch my nervous system back together in small ways. I slept more deeply. The dizziness faded, and my appetite returned slowly, cautiously, as if my body were testing whether it was safe to trust again. The hearing arrived sooner than I expected: a room that smelled like paper and old carpet, where adults spoke carefully into microphones and addressed the judge with respect that felt both formal and heavy. My parents sat together at their table, looking smaller than I remembered, their confidence muted by the presence of consequences they could not talk their way out of. Ms. Morales presented the case calmly, methodically, introducing the documentation in an order that told the story without embellishment. The photographs of the empty refrigerator, the activation record of the credit card, the call logs, the neighbor testimony, and finally, my notebook and the videos. Seeing my handwriting scanned and projected felt surreal, like watching a private thought become public record, and yet I did not feel exposed the way I once feared I would. I felt anchored because the truth was consistent, no matter who held it. When I was asked to speak, my voice did not shake as much as I expected, and I answered the questions directly, stating what happened without apology or accusation, because by then I understood that clarity was more powerful than anger. My parents spoke as well, repeating that they had not intended harm, that they had believed I was capable, that they were under stress. And the judge listened without interrupting, then asked a single question that changed the tone of the room. He asked what safeguards they had put in place to ensure my safety during their absence, and when their answers faltered, when intentions failed to translate into plans, the gap between belief and responsibility became visible to everyone. The ruling did not include jail time or dramatic punishments, and that was important because this was not about spectacle, it was about structure. The judge ordered continued supervised visitation, mandatory counseling, and ongoing review before any change in custody would be considered, emphasizing that trust would need to be rebuilt through consistent action rather than promises. When the gavel came down, the sound was not loud, but it carried a weight that settled over the room like finality. In the weeks after the hearing, life continued in a quieter way, and that quiet was different from the silence I had known before. This quiet held safety, predictability, and the absence of constant vigilance. My parents attended their required sessions, and reports filtered back through the proper channels, updates about attendance and participation that I did not have to chase or interpret. Supervised visits were scheduled in neutral spaces with professionals present, and those visits were awkward at first, filled with careful conversation and restrained emotion because the old dynamics could not operate under observation. I noticed how my mother struggled without the freedom to steer the narrative, how my father hesitated without the option to smooth things over privately, and those observations were both sad and clarifying. Distance did not erase my feelings for them, but it did change the way those feelings were allowed to move, contained now by boundaries that kept me from being pulled apart. With time, I began to understand that consequences are not meant to destroy people. They are meant to interrupt patterns, and whether those patterns change depends on what people do when excuses are no longer accepted. Living with Mrs. Brooks taught me something else as well, that safety does not have to be loud or demonstrative to be real. It can look like someone asking if you want seconds without comment, like a light left on in the hallway at night, like being believed without having to prove yourself over and over again. Those ordinary acts repaired something fundamental in me, the sense that my presence mattered even when I was not performing strength. At 27, looking back on that summer, I do not frame it as the moment my family fell apart, because that would imply it was whole before. I frame it as the moment the truth stopped being hidden, when a child turned quiet endurance into record and found adults willing to listen. My parents lost the automatic right to my compliance, not because I spoke up, but because their choices required accountability. I did not seek revenge. I sought safety, and the difference matters. Revenge demands spectacle. Safety demands boundaries. Over time, those boundaries gave me room to grow into someone who no longer confuses independence with isolation, or loyalty with silence. The notebook I kept that summer is still with me, its pages worn, the word evidence. Faded slightly from repeated handling, and I keep it not as a symbol of pain, but as a reminder of what happens when truth is treated as protection rather than betrayal. When my mother returned from Europe expecting stories and souvenirs to fill the house, she walked into a room arranged around facts. She could not outtalk a system designed to see what had been invisible and a daughter who no longer disappeared to keep the peace. The consequences were clear, the outcome measured, and the lesson lasting that freedom without responsibility is not independence, that silence does not equal strength, and that when adults choose themselves at a child's expense, the truth has a way of stepping forward to set the terms that follow.